of History, University of Bucharest, specializing in Roman history and archaeology, and it is my honor and pleasure to chair today's first panel on ancient mythographies, which concentrates on the ancient period, which, as we have already heard, is a very fertile ground for our theme today. The first speaker today is Mr. Dumitru, a doctoral student at the University of Bucharest, and someone, I think, yeah, and who is specializing on the late Seleucid period. He is researching the royalty, Seleucid royalty, and decline of the power of their power in the late 1st century BC. Mr. Dumitru, you have the floor.
Thank you. Actually, the chair. So, the name of the paper is Emulating Alexander the Great, and what we shall try to do now is to focus on what is the relationship between the image of Alexander the Great and the image that one of the dynasties that succeeded after him, that came after him, namely the Seleucids, and what is the relationship between those two images. And we shall try to see how the Seleucids imitated Alexander the Great, and in the meanwhile, whether they tried or not to make a difference between them and him. And let us proceed. That was the man, that was Alexander the Great, who was responsible not only for the creation of a huge empire, not only for the birth of the Hellenistic world, but also for the birth of the name of the Hellenistic world. And it was not him who was responsible for that, it was a modern historian, namely Droysen, who wrote a history of Alexander the Great, and thus the term was born. Why I say that? Because it is interesting to know how the impact of Alexander, how great the impact of Alexander was, not only in the ancient times, but also in the modern times. And probably it would have been a very good idea to present the reception of the myth of Alexander in the contemporary times now. But I didn't do that. So, as we all know, his gesta is studied a lot. I think even in this moment that I speak, there is someone somewhere who's now writing a biography of Alexander the Great, and the bibliography of Alexander the Great is huge, and unfortunately, the bibliography of the figures of the Seleucid kings, well, it is rather poor, except for the figure of Antiochus IV, who had the privilege of being the first persecutor of the Jews, and thus Josephus Flavius wrote a lot about him. We found him also in the Bible, in the books of Maccabees, and therefore he is probably the most famous of the Seleucid kings. The other kings didn't have didn't have a lot of historians to focus on them. So it is quite an interesting way to see how too much should compare with too few. That is the map that I hated the most, because it is the map of Alexander's expedition in the east and also of his empire, and I hated this map. Precisely of that too much that I was talking about. When I started studying history, it was some other maps that interested me, and every time I opened a history of the Hellenistic period, it was that map that I was to find, either at the beginning, either at the end, sometimes the only map. And why? This is why I hated it, because I wanted that map. I wanted at least maps to show me what was the situation after the death of Alexander the Great. As we all know, the kingdom split into several successorial states, one of them being the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, the other one being the Seleucid Empire, which we can see is comparable in size and almost in shape to that of Alexander the Great. I chose the extent of the empire at the end of the 3rd century, but at the end of the first quarter of this century, the Seleucid Empire looked pretty much like Alexander's empire, except for Egypt, because Seleucus, the founder of the dynasty that we are talking about today, managed to conquer almost everything except Greece, Egypt, and actually he was assassinated exactly when he was to become king of Macedon and to return home to Europe. The other important kingdom was Macedon itself, but it was not ruled by the dynasty of Alexander the Great, which is extinguished basically after his death. But it was ruled by some other successorial dynasty, the one of the Antigonids. And for the rest of the states, well, they are and they are not offsprings of Alexander the Great, that we could see on that map. And now, finally, we are in the middle of the map. That is his famous sculpture by Lysippus, and most of the Alexander's portraits must have looked like this one. Some tens of them, some dozens of them, are now preserved in the Istanbul Museum. I think there are 30 or 40 discovered more or less recently, and some of them were already analyzed by the classic book of Robert Smith, and most of them, of course not all, were analyzed by Andrew Stewart in his great book Faces of Power, which was precisely dedicated to the way Alexander the Great presented himself and in iconography. Well, as you can see from the text of Plutarch, we have a small problem, because this was the portrait that Alexander himself thought it fit that he should be modeled. For those peculiarities which many of his successors and friends afterwards tried to imitate, namely the poise of the neck, which was bent slightly to the left, and the melting glance of his eyes, this artist has accurately observed. Well, trouble is that, as I said, that we have some dozens of imitation of copies like this, and it is impossible for us to tell whether they really should be attributed to Alexander or not, because most of them do not have this small plaque underneath which would say this is Alexander the Great. And since we know that this particular statue bust was copied a lot, well, probably some of them could belong to some of his imitators, to some of the kings that succeeded after him, or to some private individual Alexander wannabe. And it is his portrait. It is better known from the coins. On the left, we see one of his tetradrachs, which was minted in Byblos. The portrait on the obverse is obviously Heracles. We know it is Heracles because of the lion scalp around the head. And down on the reverse is Zeus with an eagle, the symbol of celestial kingship, if I may say so. If you compare to the tetradrachm of Seleucus the Great, it is impossible not to notice that there is a certain resemblance between the portraits, those two portraits, and actually this resemblance led to a lot of confusion between the scholars, who for about 100 years have discussed whether it is Alexander the Great, and thus this tetragrammaton was struck by Seleucus in the name of Alexander the Great, so that before he was a king, or whether it is Seleucus with Alexander's traits. So then we come back to imitating his the portrait of the conqueror. The enigma was solved today by a young Greek scholar who said obviously, and he's right, obviously it has to be Seleucus and not Alexander because of the bull horns on the helmet. And this is a very interesting portrait of Seleucus because, as you can see, on the helmet, the helmet is covered by a panther skin. And what does that mean? The panther was one of the favorite animals of Dionysus. And Dionysus was the first hero ever to conquer India. And this is what Alexander did, and this is what Seleucus did. Because, after all, what was a conqueror to do? Well, he was to take a trip to the eastern India without buying a ticket at a travel agency. And that was the so-called royal Anabasis mounting up in Asia up to India. And as you can see, the kings of the Seleucid dynasty struggled desperately for India and for the east. And the Seleucid Anabasis had this particular detail that it was not organized in the moment when the king had the leisure to do it. It was organized, started, when the king had something else to do. For instance, fight a competitor at home.